أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين الغرر الميامين، سيما بقية الله في الأرضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين، سيدنا وإمام زماننا وصاحب نعمتنا وولي أمرنا مهدي هذه الأمة وطاووس أهل الجنة الحجة بن الحسن العسكري فداه أرواح العالمين. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the interest of time, I think we're going to jump right into our class, inshallah, and begin as always with this salam upon our awaited Savior, our Master, God's vicegerent, and the one who will cleanse the earth from all oppression and fill it with justice and equity, inshallah. Assalamu ala al-Mahdi الذي وعد الله عز وجل به الأمم أن يجمع به الكلم ويلم به الشعث ويملأ به الأرض قسطا وعدلا ويمكن له وينجز به وعد المؤمنين. Over the last two sessions, we've been talking about the study of religion, in particular comparative religious studies. We talked about methodology. We talked about why this is important. We talked about what our objective is when studying religion in general, and in particular Christianity as a religion that is prevalent, it is populous, it is relevant, and it's a religion that immediately precedes the advent of Islam, therefore giving it much emphasis and due care in our religious scriptures and the Holy Quran, as well as the traditions of the Prophet and his immaculate household. And I think when discussing the origin of Christianity, because we're going to address the chronological order of the Christian faith, in particular, there has to be a study of the origin story of Christianity in order for us to understand it better. But you cannot speak about the origin of Christianity without going back much further, all the way back to Prophet Abraham. May God's peace and blessings be upon our Prophet, his family, as well as Ibrahim alayhi salam. And so I'd like to use this session to talk a little bit about Prophet Abraham and drawing a distinction in the biblical narrative in contrast to the Quranic narrative, to the Islamic narrative. That is a theme that's going to come up quite regularly as we progress further in our study of Christianity. The issue that there are major disparities between the Quran and the Bible, or more broadly, Islamic literature and Jewish and Christian literature. So that's a subject that's going to come up in the History of Prophets class with Sayyid Fadil, may Allah bless him. And it's a topic that's going to come up in this class for obvious reasons. So let's jump right into this, if we may. So you will notice when studying Christianity that Abraham obviously is seen by Jews and Christians as well as Muslims as a common ancestor. So he's talked about in terms of him being a patriarch of Abrahamic religions. However, one thing that comes up fairly quickly when studying the actual nuance of the life of Abraham and his legacy is that that's basically where the similarities end. So while we all profess in Abraham's prophetic mission, we believe that he occupies a very central place within all of these three faith traditions. However, that's where the similarities end. So for example, the biblical account of the Old Testament or the Torah, when it discusses Abraham early on in the Bible, and it does so in the book of Genesis. So Genesis meaning the beginning, would obviously address this topic. And in particular, the passages that you need to pay close attention to and that will come up frequently in our discussions is Genesis chapters 11 through to 25. The Quran, however, speaks about Prophet Abraham in no less than 30 different sections, and that's not verses. So each section is at least one verse, but often a group of verses that talk about Abraham at some stage in his life, or references Abraham in one way or another vis-a-vis the surrounding subject matter. So at least 30 sections are dedicated to Abraham. And what's interesting is that unlike the Bible, which talks about Abraham at the beginning in the book of Genesis, and then it kind of stops, there's hardly any mention of Abraham later on. In the Quran, you'll see that Abraham is featured from the beginning to the end. So it's almost as if Abraham has been turned into a theme in and of himself. So I actually have a page here, which I'll share with you, that basically mentions every verse where Prophet Abraham is mentioned. It's called Verses on Abraham in the Quran. So we're just going to take a quick look at that. So here you see from Surah Al-Baqarah, from chapter number 2 in the Holy Quran, verses 124 to 136, you see Abraham being mentioned here, and interestingly enough, the first story that features is the story of Abraham and the sacrifice. وَإِذَا ابْتَلَى إِبْرَاهِيمَ رَبُّهُ بِكَلِمَاتٍ فَأَتَمَّهُنْ. So talks about Ismail, talks about Abraham leaving his family in the desert, and so that's the first thing that comes up. Although of course we know that the Quran, the order of the chapters and the surahs in the Holy Quran is not as they were revealed. The chronological order is one thing, and the way the verses and the chapters are placed in the Quran is different. So this is not a chronological list of the story of Abraham. But anyway, it's quite interesting that this is where it starts. And then once again in Surah Al-Baqarah, about 120 verses later, Abraham is mentioned. And then again in Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah speaks about a particular snapshot, if you like, from the life of Abraham, where he asks God to solidify his faith. And he says, وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّ أَرِنِي كَيْفَ تُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى. Show me how you resurrect the dead. And so that story is mentioned there. Then in Surah Al-Imran, in several different sections, he's also mentioned. Then in Surah Al-Nisa, then in Surah Al-An'am. And in Surah Al-An'am, we kind of pivot to an origin story, a coming of age story of Abraham alayhi salatu wassalam, the tension between Abraham and his uncle Azar, as well as the struggles between him and his people. Then in Surah Al-An'am once again, Surah Al-Tawbah again, Surah Hud, Yusuf, Ibrahim, Al-Hajr, Al-Nahl, Maryam, and so on and so forth. So at least 30 verses, which, as I said, I'll share this document with you, for your reference and your review, inshallah. The point here that's being made is that Abraham features prominently in the Quran. So that's one difference between the biblical narrative and the Quranic version of the story of Abraham. But then there is an even more important difference between these two narratives. The narrative in the book of Genesis revolves around the themes of, there are two themes essentially. And the story of Abraham kind of revolves around these two themes exclusively. Number one, it's about posterity, and the second is about land. Posterity meaning his lineage, his heritage, his children, what's going to happen to them. There is this sense that Abraham is obsessed with his lineage, as well as where his lineage are going to live. And this is a theme that is even bigger than the first. The idea that the children of Abraham are going to be a great nation, they're going to inherit the land, they're going to live on this land. This is something that's quite emphasized in the book of Genesis, which is part of the Old Testament for those of you who don't know. The Quranic narrative, however, is very different. It portrays Abraham as being concerned with belief in God, with monotheism, right? That is, again, once you go through those verses, you'll realize that Abraham's biggest concern was his people believing in God and his family and children also maintaining that tradition. That was his biggest concern. So you can see quite a big disparity between these two narratives being created already. The issue of his progeny or legacy does feature, but not as prominently. And the question of what's going to happen to his children, whether he's going to have any children to begin with, is something that does come up, but it only comes up towards the end of his life, as opposed to it occupying any significant space in his life and his thought. So very big differences between these two. Abraham's beginning in the Quran, for example, shows him to be this inquisitive, devoted, this courageous young man who challenges his own family, his foster father, who happened to be his uncle as well as his larger community, who held pagan beliefs, and Abraham obviously challenges them on that. Even though this entire section, the story of Abraham tearing down the idols, challenging his people, being catapulted into the fire, none of that is found in the Jewish and Christian literature. So a big chunk of what constitutes the personality, the anxieties of Abraham, is nowhere to be found. In the Bible, as we said, he is mostly concerned about his heritage and the acquisition of land. So it's something that's, again, if you read up on Abraham and the biblical narrative, you'll find that there is this question about the covenant, right? The covenant of the pieces, how God promised Abraham certain things, right? It's always about God making a set of promises, and then Abraham constantly being anxious about whether or not those promises are going to be fulfilled by God, which strikes right through the Quranic narrative, which is about Abraham having this incredible trust in God, Abraham believing in God, and that God is going to fulfill his word and his promise. That is a no-brainer as far as Abraham is concerned in the Quran. But in the Bible, Abraham constantly feels as though he's unsure, he's doubtful, he's anxious. So two very stark images being portrayed and painted right there. Then you find many other differences emerging, right? These differences have to do with perhaps what you might consider minor nuances in the story, but they are important nonetheless. For example, the family of Abraham, who his father was, for example, his relationship with Lot or Prophet Lut in the Holy Quran, his migration, why he migrates from his birthplace, the city of Ur in Iraq, to Canaan. What happens there, why he moves to begin with, is rather obscure in the Bible. Even down to his marriage to his wife Sarah, which according to the biblical narrative, according to the Old Testament, his wife was actually his half-sister, which is incredibly problematic, right? His own half-sister ends up getting married to him. Whereas in the Islamic literature, Sarah was the cousin of Abraham, which again, there's a big disparity right there. However, the biggest and I guess most problematic disparity between the two narratives is perhaps highlighted in what's called the birth oracle, right? So as we said, the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis is mostly covered between these two chapters, chapter 11 and 25. So here, we're going to take you to Genesis chapter 16. And this is from the New International Version of the Bible. Again, if you look at other versions, you'll find some discrepancies, some minor differences, but the gist of it is basically the same. So I want to read this section out for you and just, highlight the parts that I think are incredibly problematic. So Hagar and Ishmael, they come up in chapter 16. So at this point, let's just actually read through that section and then we'll try and provide commentary if needed. So chapter 16 begins with this. Now Sarai, Abram's wife. So Abram was Abraham before the covenant. His original name was Abram, but then it changes to Abraham down the line. Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, right? She has no children, and she's getting old. She's barren, so she can't have any children to begin with, right? So at some point, she comes to Abraham with an offer. She had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Now, just taking a quick side note here, the Jewish and Christian narrative, when it gets to this part, they couldn't help but feel incredibly uncomfortable with this. And they're uncomfortable with it for several reasons, not least of which is Abraham's willingness to simply copulate with this slave girl who has no relation with him. So as the Bible says, she was Sarah's slave. Sarah offers for Abraham to simply sleep with her, which means that there is no marriage contract. And according to the Jewish narrative, he wasn't even allowed to marry her. So he simply fornicates with this slave girl. Now, this causes a huge problem because according to Judaism and Christianity, Abraham committed a grave sin. So already we see Abraham being accused of fornication. Na'udhu billah. And because of that, commentators have talked about how Abraham here made a big blunder, big mistake. He should not have accepted the offer made by Sarah. He should not have slept with her slave girl Hagar, and that relationship was unlawful and illicit. As a result, the child born from this relationship, essentially, he is born out of wedlock. And he will carry this legacy for the rest of his life. So essentially what they say is that Abraham should have waited for God to fulfill his promise. God promised to give him a child. Abraham refused to accept or to believe in God fulfilling his promise. Therefore, he jumped the gun and he did what he was not supposed to, right? Whereas in the Islamic literature, we know that Abraham's relationship with Hajar, with Hagar, was lawful, and that prophets do not commit fornication. I mean, that is a given. So Abraham agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. So here, suddenly it pivots and it changes the narrative to this being a marriage. But again, that's not generally accepted in Christianity and Judaism, and they do not accept this as a lawful relationship. So he slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. So now, as soon as Hagar becomes pregnant, Sarah regrets the decision to offer her slave to Abraham. And she starts to despise her. In other words, envy begins to build up here toward her slave. Commentators have suggested the reason she became envious was because Sarah was expecting God to make to fulfill his promise to the child of Abraham, but in this case the child is going to be someone else's, it's not going to be Sarah's, so that's why she's envious of her. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." So already we see not just tension, but actual marital problems building up here. Parenthetically, let me mention one thing here. In our Islamic sources, up to this point, or parts of this narrative are accepted. That Sarah came to Abraham with the offer to wed her slave and to conceive from her is something that our traditions acknowledge. And in fact, our hadiths say that God, because of this sacrifice that Sarah did, God then rewarded her with bearing her own son, Ishaq alayhi salam. So that's one point. The other point is that we do have literature, we do have hadiths that say that Sarah was a source of for lack of a better term, heartache for Abraham. That she did cause him to be upset, that she was jealous. Things that are generally accepted to be normal parts of the human condition, right? Any fallible human being, any normal individual would experience these emotions and these negative traits. So it wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but we do have hadiths that Ibrahim alayhi salam would often speak to God and complain of his wife's mannerisms, his wife's conduct, and that she gave him a hard time. And so, that is something that we believe, but again, the biblical narrative is much harsher. She says to him, "You're responsible for the wrong. You did this. It's your mistake, and now you have to deal with her. In fact, may the Lord judge between you and me." Right? So she kind of curses Abraham in a sense. "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Now, I want you to pay close attention to what happens next. Sarah mistreats Hagar. She begins to abuse her slave. So, whether it be verbal abuse or physical abuse, we don't know. But she treats her in a manner that was so harsh that Hagar then flees from Sarah. She fled from her mistress. So then, in verse number 7, chapter 16 again, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. So, Hajar is now gone. She abandons her husband. She abandons her owner, who was Sarah. She simply leaves and goes into the desert. At this point, God sends an angel, according to the Bible, to sway Hajar, to convince her to go back, right? It was the spring that is beside the road to shore. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She responds by saying, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, so Now the angel is trying to convince Hajar to go back. So now imagine you're trying to convince someone to go back to an abusive owner, an abusive family member, or whatever the case may be. Any person who wants to convince someone to do something would obviously use persuasive language, would try to convince them in a manner that makes them sort of accept the prospect of going back. So the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." So the angel gives Hajar glad tidings. He tells her that the future is bright, even though things may seem bleak at the moment, but you have a bright future. You will have so many children, they'll be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael. The Lord has heard of your misery." Then all of a sudden, the narrative changes completely. Look at this section here. "He," meaning your son, "will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers." Now, at this point, anyone who reads this will realize that something went completely haywire. This does not make any sense, because the language changes all of a sudden, and it takes a complete 180 in the sense, because the angel is trying to convince Hajar that you're going to have a boy. His name's going to be Ishmael, which is all hunky-dory, it's all beautiful. But then suddenly, the angel starts to tell Hajar how her son will be a wild donkey of a man, and that he will have hostility with everyone. He's going to hate everyone. Everyone's going to hate him, and he will live in hostility with all of his brothers. Suddenly, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me," she says to the angel. For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roy. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hajar bore Abram a son, and so forth. So I want to show you something here, which I think you'll find quite interesting. And that is this part here. If you look at biblical commentaries, you'll find there's a lot of confusion. Let's see if we can actually open this page here. No, actually, we'll just read it from here. Make this a little bit bigger. All right. So you have some commentaries, right? For example, Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges. As a wild ass among men, wild donkey among men, right? The description of Ishmael vividly portrays the characteristics of his descendants. Can you believe this? I know this is a class, but honestly, it's an absolute joke. In other words, not only does the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges doubles down, not only does it double down on this description that Ishmael was a wild donkey of a man, it even generalizes that description on all the descendants of Ishmael, right? The wild ass, for which there are other references, is the typically untamable, strong, free, roaming, suspicious, and untrustworthy animal, meaning the donkey, living wild in the desert, far from the haunts of men, right? Then it goes on to say, in the presence of all of his brethren, while in the presence or in the face of all his brethren might legitimately be rendered to the east of the Israelites. The east was scarcely the quarter in which the Ishmaelites were chiefly found. A better explanation gives to the words the meaning of a foe dwelling close at hand and over against his brethren, right? Let's go to this commentary. Ellicott's commentary for English readers. This is a little bit more watered down, right? He will be a wild man. He will be a wild ass man. The wild ass of the Arabian deserts is a very noble creature. So it doesn't question the description and the incredible turn of events and the way the angel's prophecy pivots from being positive and beautiful to it being completely erratic. It doesn't address that. It simply says, look, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Donkeys are not bad creatures. They're very noble creatures, and is one of the animals selected in the book of Job as especially exemplifying the greatness of God. Characteristics are great speed, love of solitude, and an untamable fondness of liberty. It is thus the very type of the Bedouin Arabs whose delight is to rove at will over the desert and who despise the ease and luxury of a settled life. So kind of watered down, but still extremely confusing. His hand will be against every man. The Bedouin can be bound by no treaties, submit to no law, and count plunder as legitimate gain. Right? Nevertheless, he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. That is, he shall maintain the independence, and his descendants shall continue to exist as a free race in the presence of the other Abrahamic nations. Many commentators, however, consider that the more exact translation is, he shall dwell to the east of all his brethren. This is certainly the meaning of the word in Genesis, but does not suit equally well there in Genesis 25 to 18. Then you have, let's see, pulpit commentary. Once again, it says it aptly depicts the Bedouin as boundless love of freedom as he rides about in the desert, a spear in hand upon his camel or his horse, hardy frugal, reveling in the varied beauty of nature and despising town life in every form, right? As Ishmael and his offspring were here called wild ass men, so Ishmael is designated by the prophet sheepmen, right? So essentially, you get the gist here. This is extremely derogatory. It's an incredible pejorative that Bible commentators have struggled with trying to explain. Benson commentary says, wild ass of a man, so the word is rude and bold and fearing, no man, untamed, untraceable, living at large and impatient of service and constraint, right? And they have been for almost 4,000 years infamous for theft, pillage, robbery, revenge, and murder. I mean, once again, the angel is giving glad tidings to Hajar, news of what's going to happen in the future to convince her to go back to her husband and to her mistress. But it does so like this, that the children of Ishmael will be fond of theft, pillage, robbery, revenge, and murder. It hath therefore, as Mr. Brown justly observes, been the continued and common interest of mankind to extirpate them from the earth. But though almost every noted conqueror who hath appeared in the world, whether Persian, goes all the way here, we have seen another remarkable prophecy most evidently fulfilled and a continued standing proof where the race of the whole world, exactly like that which arises from the present state of the Jews, of the truth of divine revelation. In other words, he's saying that this verse is testimony to the truth of the Bible. Because when we look at Arabs, we see the exact description of the Bible. They are fond of theft, murder, pillaging, and bloodshed, right? For Ishmael had 12 sons, right? But this was also chiefly intended of his posterity. For Ishmael had 12 sons who gave rise to as many tribes or nations, called by their names, and who dwelt southward in Arabia. And so on and so forth. So if you go to all these other commentaries, and the link can be provided here for you, I want you to actually go there and find the most outrageous descriptions and commentaries that have been made with regards to this part in the Bible. Now, I will end with 2 quick points. The first is, we mentioned some discrepancies between the Quranic narrative and the biblical narrative. What I'd like you to do for your homework, inshallah, is to go back and highlight, to basically draw 2 columns. You have in one column the biblical narrative and the other column the Quranic narrative or the Islamic narrative, and try and come up with as many discrepancies between these two narratives vis-a-vis Prophet Ibrahim and his family, right? So we mentioned a couple, like his wife being his cousin versus his half-sister, and some of the other points. But I'd like you to come up with more points if you can as part of your independent study, inshallah. That's point number one. Point number two is, subhanallah, if you look at the Quranic narrative, I think it's obvious why Prophet Ismail is mentioned in this derogatory way in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, right? And this is actually a consistent theme. There are more examples of the biblical narrative serving a, I guess for lack of a better word, a political agenda, or serving a tribal cause, where the biblical narrative fits into the larger story of the Jews and the Arabs, or more broadly, the Jews and their neighbors being in conflict. And as a result of that, the biblical narrative kind of reflects the socio-political dynamic of the time, right? There's another very, very important example of that, which we will mention later, inshallah, about Prophet Lut, right? So the story of Lot sleeping with his two daughters is something that can easily be traced back to the socio-political dynamics of the Jews, being in conflict with their neighbors. So that's something that we're going to show. But this is all part of that same theme as we alluded to. Whereas, if you look at the Quran, you'd imagine that if the Quran was invented by the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the Prophet would want to counter these allegations, these accusations, these extremely derogatory references to him and to the larger Arab race. The Prophet would want to use the Quran to counter these points. The Prophet would want to invent verses that would respond to these derogatory references in the Bible. If he had invented it, this is what he would do. This is what I would do. This is what anyone would do. Whereas if you go to the Quran, the parts of the Quran where Prophet Ishaq is mentioned, right? Where Isaac is mentioned, he is mentioned with nothing but praise. And one verse which I'd like to draw your attention to is this verse right here, which sums up what the Quran actually believes about Prophet Ishaq ala nabiyina wa alihi wa alayhi salam. And it's this verse right here. This is in Surah As-Saffat, verse number 112. This is it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses Prophet Ibrahim, or addresses the Prophet, our messenger, in reference to Prophet Ibrahim. وَبَشَّرْنَاهُ بِإِسْحَاقَ نَبِيًّا مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. We gave glad tidings to him, meaning to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, نَبِيًّا مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ, who was a prophet and he was among the righteous ones. Subhanallah. And therein lies one of the biggest stark differences between the Quranic narrative and the biblical narrative. That the way the Quran speaks about prophets is it does so with high esteem, with praise, right? Even those prophets that you would think would be used as pawns in this tribal battle between the Israelites and the Arabs. You would think that the Prophet If he had invented the Quran, he would disparage Ishaq because of that long-standing tension between these two tribes. You would think that in response to the disparaging comments made in the Bible with regards to Ishmael, that Ishaq would be the first victim. But far from it. The Quran, when Allah speaks about Ishaq, He speaks about him. He places him in high esteem and speaks about him with the most lofty and most glamorous terms. وَبَشَّرْنَاهُ, we gave glad tidings to Ibrahim that he will have Ishaq, who was a prophet and among the righteous ones. I will conclude there because our timing is kind of all over the place tonight. Inshallah, I will take some questions and then end the class, inshallah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajjal farajah. So, a lot of people sending salams and prayers. Thank you so much for that. Jazakumullah khayra jaza'il muhsinin. A question says, last week you mentioned that Sayyidah Khadija was on the Abrahamic faith or Al-Hanifiyya. What is the difference between that and Christianity? I thought people were following Prophet Jesus, not Ibrahim, before Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So as I said, I will just quickly recap. We had three religions that existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. The most predominant was the pagan religion. And the pagans, obviously, they came in different forms, different shapes and sizes. So you had those who were completely atheistic. They didn't believe in God. You had those who did believe in God, but believed that this God had these idols, and the idols essentially replaced God and did his work for him. You had all manner of different religions, but you can kind of lump them all together in the kind of the umbrella term paganism. You also had the Jews and the Christians. You had the people of the book. You had Jews who lived in Fadak, for example, or Khaybar. You had Jews who lived near Medina, Jews who lived near Mecca. And then, of course, you had the Christians. However, the family of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as heirs to Prophet Ibrahim, as descendants of Ibrahim, these were followers of the religion of Abraham. What was the religion of Abraham? It was the Hanifiyya. And we've talked about this previously, particularly in theology class. But essentially, it was a religion that followed the primordial, the pure, unadulterated, primordial nature of man. In other words, what we refer to as the fitrah. So they followed the fitrah and the Hanifiyya of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. The Quran does refer to the forefathers and the ancestors of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and speaks about them being in prostration. وَتَقَلُّبَكَ فِي السَّاجِدِينَ. So they prostrated, and they prostrated before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but that prostration didn't have the same form as our prayers, as the prayers that were introduced by the Holy Messenger of God, but rather it was more simplistic, and it was sort of a bared down and reductive kind of acts of worship. We have another question. Sister Zainab is saying, you still don't seem well. Our prayers are with you. Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khair. I don't know why, but this illness has kind of lasted longer than I had hoped. So I do beg for your du'as, inshallah. Somebody's saying it's so obvious that they're trying to disparage the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, saying that the descendants of Ishmael are donkeys. Yes, that is definitely part of the problem here. Is the class being recorded? Yes, generally we do record classes, inshallah. Hopefully we won't have any issues with this recording. We are running into some technical problems, but hopefully we won't have issues. For the assignment, where can we access Genesis 11 to 25? You don't need to, just a Google search, Genesis 11 to 25, you'll find it. The website that I've referenced here is called Bible Hub. That's generally a good website that I often use because of all the commentaries and the different versions of the Bible that it presents. When do we submit the assignment? Well, you have a week until next class, inshallah. If you can submit it before then, that would be great, Sister Patel. Brother Awan says, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It says, I don't think this class is being recorded. Hopefully it is. Okay, so Brother Lu'ay is saying, where do we submit the assignment? Send it to the email address. So hawza@ahlulbayt.tv, and I should be able to get it there, inshallah. Okay, so a question says, even if the Holy Prophet created the Quran, God forbid, why would he disparage Ishaq? How does that help him? As I said, this obviously is a hypothetical scenario, which is untrue. But what I'm saying is that had the Prophet invented the Quran, as some of our adversaries claim, they say that the Prophet made up the Quran, it was never revealed to him. But if that were the case, if we were to accept that, then surely there would be a point-scoring match between the Prophet and the Jews. Surely there would be an attempt to get back at the disparaging comment, as I said, the pejorative narrative that we find in the Bible. And since they're attacking the ancestor of our Prophet, he would attack their ancestor, in this case, Prophet Ishaq. But of course, that does not happen. Again, a lot of people asking about my health. Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khair. I really do appreciate your concern. I am getting better, but it's just, kind of slow. Did Prophet Ibrahim marry Hajar, or was it halal because she was his slave? In other words, what your right hand possesses. As far as I could remember, it appears that he married her. So the reason I say that is because he did not own Hajar. His wife did, right? So it appears that she must have freed Hajar, and then Hajar was married to Ibrahim. As far as I can remember, I could always go back and double check, but that I think is what happened. And final question is, I've read and understood from my Jewish rabbi friend that Abraham is portrayed as a, forgive me, fornicating husband who abandoned Hajar in a harsh desert, leaving her to fend for herself, while they idolate Isaac as a family man who adopted his wife. Also, how do the Christians characterize the 12 princes mentioned in the book of Genesis? Yes, so there have been attempts to identify those 12 princes and the 12 nations that would be given to Ishmael. But it almost, when you read that list, it almost feels like when you're reading a Sunni trying to justify the 12 successors of the Prophet who would be from Quraysh, and the 12 Imams hadith, which is quite famous, because they'll be it's a very erratic and incoherent attempt to try and identify those individuals. It doesn't quite fit, and there's a lot of discrepancy, there's a lot of contradictions, but there have been attempts made by them. We'll get to that, inshallah, in a future lesson, inshallah. Okay. There are a lot more questions. I don't know if we should end it here or maybe take one or two more questions. Somebody's saying, Sayyid, I haven't paid the fee yet. Should I wait until the PayPal problem is sorted or go ahead with the payment now? We'll let you know, inshallah. We'll post something on the group, so that should be fine. Don't you worry about those things. Will we get a copy of the notes? Yes, inshallah. I'll post it right after class. Final question. Assalamu alaikum. This is by Sister Zainab. Apologies for this question, as I perhaps need to go through all of your theology classes, as the answer to my question might be there. What I want to ask is, why did the people of Prophet Ibrahim not follow Prophet Moses or Jesus when they were sent to the world? Why did they continue to follow Prophet Ibrahim's creed? Because if they did, they would be Christians, but in the true sense of the word, as Prophet Jesus was the last prophet sent before Rasulullah was sent to the world. So if I understand this question correctly, since there were other prophets who were sent after Prophet Ibrahim, why didn't those who maintained Al-Hanifiyya, those like the Prophet's parents and his grandparents, why didn't they switch to those religions? Well, we don't know for a fact that Christianity and Judaism came to abrogate the religion of Abraham. There's no suggestion that that is the case. Islam came to abrogate all previous revelations, yes. But to suggest that Christianity came to abrogate every previous religion, we have nothing to suggest that. And so perhaps this was the religion of Abraham was exempted from any form of abrogation. That if you followed the religion of Abraham, then you would not need to switch religions to Christianity or to Judaism. Interestingly, on the question of Judaism, it's a very tribal religion. In other words, it's the creed and the ethnicity are combined. You can't separate these from one another. Yes, there are some Reformed Jews who say that one can convert into Judaism, that you can become a Jew if you follow the creed, if you follow the practices and the rituals of Judaism. But for the most part, at least historically, Judaism was a religion exclusive to the Israelites. And so you couldn't embrace this religion. You couldn't become a Jew if you weren't an Israelite. And as far as Christianity is concerned, we know that by the time the Holy Prophet ﷺ was given his prophetic mission, Christianity was deformed beyond recognition. And Jesus was seen as the Son of God. It was a very Pauline religion, and we'll get to that inshallah in future sessions. That's going to be very, very important. It was the religion of Paul as opposed to the religion of Jesus. So I hope that answers that question. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah bless you. And I'll see you very soon, inshallah. As I said, we'll share the notes shortly. So hopefully get cracking on that assignment. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل